Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this special hearing of the Budget and Finance Committee. Today is March 17th, 2014. I'm Paul Krikorian, Chair of the committee, and we have a full contingent of committee members with us, Council members Mitchell Englander, Bob Blumenfield, Paul Kretz, and Michael Bonin, and we are ready to begin this evening's hearing. Tonight we'll hear presentations from our CAO and our CLA on the city's collective efforts to address our ongoing budget challenges, our structural deficit, and to begin the preparation of budgets that put us on the path towards restoration of services that have been devastated over the last several years. I think before we begin, it's important first of all, it's important for us to know what we're doing and what we're not doing tonight. We will be hearing an updated report from the CAO, updating the three-year plan that's previously been adopted by this council in the midst of the economic turmoil of the last few years. But we won't be acting on this report. We won't be taking a vote on the recommendations that are proposed, either in this report or in other discussions today. So this is a discussion of where we are, and it's an opportunity for us to draw input from the members of the public who are here as well. So in case anybody is concerned about anything that might be contained in terms of recommendations in the report, there won't be any action on that tonight. This is informational only. So before we begin, I do want to take just a little step back and put tonight's meeting in a historical context. This city has gone through the most difficult 5 years in its history, probably, with its budget. Since the economic collapse of 2008 put the world's economy in a tailspin, the city has had to make cuts that were probably unimaginable before that. But the result of the efforts that we have made as a city through collective efforts of the city's leadership, our labor unions, our neighborhood councils and other participants in this process, there has been tremendous success in eliminating most of the structural deficit that we were facing. Just 4 years ago, when I was first elected to this council, the CAO was projecting a fiscal deficit in the general fund for this fiscal year that we're currently in, or that we're looking forward to, of $1.2 billion. $1.2 billion deficit. And that deficit has been whittled down in the years since then to around $250 million. So 80% of that challenge has already been met. So now our task is to address the remaining challenge, and it won't be easy because the way we've gotten here has been through significant reductions in our workforce. We're now 14% below where we were at our high in 2007 in terms of number of employees. We have the smallest workforce that we've had since Tom Bradley was mayor. We've lost over 5,000 positions of employees who were serving our constituents. And so that's been a significant reduction. It's been a reduction in our personnel. It's been a reduction in the services that they provide. We've embarked upon pension reform. We've consolidated departments. We've created efficiencies within departments. We've begun the process of public-private partnerships in some areas where that has been able to lead to cost reductions. So through a variety of means, we've whittled away at this problem. The challenge is that we still have $250 or so million of solutions to find in the coming fiscal year, and most of the low-hanging fruit is long since gone. So it's important to remember that while the economy is beginning to recover and revenues are starting to increase, we are not out of the woods by a long shot yet, and we are still in for several more painful, difficult budget years before we have this challenge behind us. So with that, before we bring up Mr. Santana, members, anybody would like to offer anything as introductory comments before we start, or shall we Shall we dive right in? All right. Then in that case, I'd like to ask our CAO, Miguel Santana, to come to the front table and present his report. And as he's coming forward, if anybody would like to offer public comment on the budget, please fill out one of these cards and bring it forward, and we'll be gathering them and we'll be taking public comment after the reports. Mr. Santana, welcome.
Thank you and good evening. Happy St. Patrick's Day to everyone.
And to you as well.
As you indicated, Mr. Chairman, these have been very difficult times for the city, and there's certainly a lot to acknowledge in terms of the difficult choices that have been made by your council. We have a PowerPoint that we're following, and we're having difficulty in putting up on the screen, but there are extra copies for the public that my staff will hand out if you would like a copy of it. So turning on to the second page of the PowerPoint, you could see that the city has in fact reached some major accomplishments. We set out early on to replenish the reserve fund after we had to rely on it to close to fiscal year 9-10 in the black. And your council has been successful in not only reaching the goal of 5%, but actually exceeding it, with a reserve fund currently at 6.79% and a budget stabilization fund, which only a year ago was only $500,000 to now being $61.5 million. Combined, they represent 8% of the general fund. We have a policy to invest in our capital, which for many years we weren't unable to, and this year we actually did, which is 1% of the general fund. We started dealing with our liabilities, particularly in police overtime, and started relying more and more on ongoing revenues to deal with ongoing problems. There's been a focus on core services, and as you indicated, Mr. Chairman, the city has had to make some difficult choices, which has resulted in efficiencies in every single department. At the same time, there's been a renewed commitment to repairing our streets, restoring library hours, engaging in a smarter way of deploying our fire services, and engaging in consolidations of certain functions like public safety into the police department. There's been models for alternative service delivery models that are in full operation at our convention center and at the Northeast Valley Animal Shelter, a partnership with Best Friends, which has resulted in the reduction in animals being euthanized. And we've made significant progress in bringing about a more sustainable workforce. The most challenge has been, as you indicated, reducing the size of the workforce by 14%. As challenging as keeping it at that level over the last 3 years. We've adopted pension tiers, not just with our sworn personnel, but our civilians and also with the DWP employees. And we've been able to replace efforts to deal with the crisis, such as furloughs, with ongoing concessions, including a 4% contribution towards retiree health care. And in terms of our revenues, the city has engaged in more focused efforts to go after collections, going through accounts and ensuring that we're maximizing those revenues as we did last year and identified $42 million in the Department of Transportation alone. And going through the process, which I know the controller and my office will be issuing a report on this next week, looking at all the remaining funds that exist within the city. So a lot of progress has been made. The challenge is that we still have a challenge. And if you look in the next slide, the projections in terms of the deficits that we see continue. And this is, of course, assuming that the economy continues to grow at a steady pace, which fortunately it has been. And you could see it in downtown, in Hollywood, and Universal City, the construction that's taking place. You could see it in the increases in home prices and the downward slide of unemployment. But despite those increases in revenues, we're still expecting a deficit for next year of approximately $242 million. Now, of course, the final deficit isn't determined until after the mayor's budget is presented to you, and so that number will change slightly. But then years after that, we still see deficits that hover around $200 million and then finally start going down. So the next 4 years continue to be a challenge, as you indicated. Now, the difficulty that we're facing now is that while we've gone through this tremendous amount of challenge over the last few years, there's obviously an increased demand for services. And you could see it in part based on the kinds of requests we receive from departments. If we were to fund all of the requests that departments have made for this budget cycle, we would have to find an additional $370 million. And having gone through this process and going through it with the mayor's staff, I could tell you that none of these are excessive or inappropriate. They all are demands on services that our constituents are adequately asking for. An example of this, fire department asked for nearly $80 million, ITA for $50 million, and the police department for $103 million to strengthen their respective missions. So there's still clearly a demand for improved services as reflected by these requests. What we're seeing is that the good news here is that our revenues are in fact growing. And this fiscal year was the first time that we actually, in the last 4, have exceeded where we were in pre-recession. And we're anticipating that for next year, for those 7 economically sensitive revenues, which include the utility tax, business tax, sales tax, hotel and documentary transfer tax, and parking taxes, we're seeing a growth of 4.4%. This is a sizable increase, and we're anticipating that growth to continue over the next few years. We've also encountered, as we indicated earlier, a reduced staffing level. And one of the main issues that we're proposing is that we maintain that staffing level at about the same level. We consider this level today as a new normal. So as we look at restoring services, our objectives will have to be to find alternative ways of providing that service or reprioritizing existing services with the existing staffing that we have. Unfortunately, the revenues that we're receiving still do not exceed the anticipated expenditures based on this staffing levels alone. And of course, those costs are being driven by health care, compensation, workers' comp, and pensions. On pensions, the good thing is that we are finally starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel. And a few years ago, your council made a decisive decision to tackle this issue and decided to adopt a new pension tier both for sworn and civilian employees. And so what we're projecting based on the latest illustrations we received from the 2 pension systems, that our pension costs will actually peak in 2016-17 at about $1.1 billion and start descending soon after that. Now, what will make a difference to those projections are if we start growing the size of the workforce beyond what the actuaries have assumed, which is the current level. Any raises that we give on the sworn side alone, for every dollar of raise we give, we have to find an additional 50 cents to add for pension cost. And of course, there are changes that we can't control, such as the economy. If there's a sudden disruption to the stock market, then that obviously impacts. Or if our pension systems decide to change the rate of return assumption or some of the other assumptions based on how long people are living, all of that will change the projections that we see now. But at least since I've been here, this is the first time that we actually see those contributions descending. The city has, as we indicated, the strongest reserves in its history, nearly 8%. And the reserve fund is important not just because it is reviewed by investors and our bond rating agencies as sort of a reflection of the healthy state of our finances, but also in light of the difficult choices ahead, the reserve fund will be a critical component to ensuring that we transition over the next few years. Some of the challenges we continue to face are issues that partly surfaced in the context of the fiscal crisis. If you recall, a few years ago, as part of addressing the fiscal crisis, the city moved away from paying cash overtime, which we were paying about $100 million at that time, to banking overtime, what that did was reduce the amount of actual cash overtime that we were paying significantly. But what it also did, it created a bank that becomes a liability that we have to confront later. And so part of the next few years is figuring out the right balance between overtime, which is a necessary part of policing, as the chief would say, the size of the workforce at LAPD, and of course investing in civilianizing certain positions. I was on the phone with the chief today, and certainly the city has had to place police officers in our jail, but that's certainly not the ideal scenario. Eventually the goal should be is to have civilians manage our jails, but the city is simply not in the fiscal position to do so. But overtime is one of those issues we're going to have to grapple with, not only in terms of figuring out what the right amount is to pay in cash, but also figuring out how to deal with the liability that has been created as a result of the banking of that time. As I mentioned earlier, we've made progress in starting to invest in our infrastructure. And our infrastructure in this chart on page 10 illustrates how for the first time in fiscal year 13-14 since 2007, we've actually been able to meet the 1% goal of the CIEP. Why is this important? Because obviously if we deferred attention to our infrastructure, to replace that infrastructure becomes much more expensive. And this is not just important in relation to bricks and mortar, which it reflects. It's also important in our information technology. As a result of the crisis, we have deferred real investment in our basic programs for information technology, as I'm sure Mr. Renneker would articulate to you. The next few years will be about making a reinvestment in those areas. And so one of the recommendations we have is that we begin the process of establishing a 5-10-year strategic plan, figuring out how to invest adequately in sort of the short term, but also to keep an eye for the long term. The CLA and I just released a report regarding the state of our streets. And Mr. Englander and Mr. Mcquisten, have really taken on a leadership role on this issue and have focused on the need to invest in our streets and our sidewalks. And we certainly won't talk about this in the context of this report too much, but other than to say that in order to address the failed streets in our infrastructure, we will have to identify a new revenue source to do so. The revenue streams that we currently have, both state and federal and our own revenue streams, are simply not enough to meet that need. So as part of this report, we issue a series of recommendations, bringing them back to the 5 principles that your council adopted early on in the crisis. Those principles continue to be relevant today, and we think continue to provide a roadmap to help us navigate the next few years. The most critical of these recommendations is that your council take a policy position to eliminate the structural deficit by 2018. And the reason we recommend that is because the structural deficit has been essentially an albatross around our neck. Our ability to adequately invest in our services has been limited by having to put every new dollar into a deficit. Imagine a time when we actually don't have a deficit, and as the revenues continue to grow, then we invest those back in our infrastructure, back into our workforce, and in actually restoring services. And until that deficit is completely gone, the city would be in a very difficult position to do so. So establishing that as a policy direction from your council will be the first step in getting us there. The second is that while we've done amazing work in strengthening our reserves, we also believe that the optimal goal for the total reserve should be 10%. Getting there is not going to be easy. It's going to take time to do so, particularly since it's almost inevitable that we're going to have to rely on some of our reserves to simply get by the next few years. But at the end of the next 4 years, our goal should be to keep a 10% reserve. And we do that by ensuring that one-time revenues get deposited to bring the reserves to the level we seek. That's how the reserve fund was actually established at the level it is today. One of the things that we get acknowledged by our bond rating agencies is that the budget doesn't begin and end in the spring. That in fact, on July 1st, the budget really, the process continues, and we do that through your committee, or my office issues quarterly financial status reports, and your council adopts solutions as problems surface, as opposed to waiting till the end of the year to deal with them. That allows us to make decisions, to closely monitor revenues and expenditures, and ensure that we end up balanced at the end of the year. And so we recommend continuing that practice. We also recommend addressing major liabilities that loom over us. Your council has been very successful in addressing liabilities, particularly around reciprocity with the DWP, dealing with settling cases with our city attorneys and others. There are still other liabilities we're confronting around sidewalks and the Ardon case, which is regarding our utility user tax, that we're going to confront in the next few years. And the city attorney has established a renewed commitment in resolving those cases, and also establishing a process of looking at perhaps less high-profile cases and establishing methods of corrective action. So there is already corrective action that is required by many of the settlements that you adopt, but we're recommending going further by actually having those corrective actions audited a year later and a few years later to make sure that they're being fully implemented. Why? Because it's important that we don't make the same mistakes over and over again within a department and throughout the city. We also recommend that as the budget situation changes at the federal and state level, sometimes for the better, sometimes not for the better, that you think carefully about backstopping any reductions that may occur at that time, and weigh those decisions against other priorities that are within the city's control. Number 6, we recommend looking at our capital program and actually developing and adopting a 5-year capital program, strategic plan, so that investments in our capital are done mindfully, not just year after year. My office released a report regarding fire deployment. We recommend that you look at that report carefully and adopt the recommendations that were established by an outside consultant that looks how to run the fire department more efficiently, but also reinvest those savings back into technology and civilization of the workforce. And we also recommend a similar study being done in the police department to find the right balance between the use of overtime, the size of the workforce, and the civilization of various functions. We recommend a strategic plan around information technology, which is currently underway under the direction of the ITALK committee. That report should be coming to you within the next 30 days. We also recommend an investment into our 311 system as the place that Angelinos go to receive services, and look at consolidating functions around the 311 so that it is the number of places people go to for help is reduced down to 1. We also recommend adopting an economic development strategy that uses our city assets as opportunities for investment and development, but partnering between the Department of Economic Development, which your council created last year, and a nonprofit corporation. And further recommendations of that are forthcoming. There are further work to be done in terms of ensuring a sustainable workforce, particularly requiring that all city employees pay 10% of the premium. Already about 25% of our workforce pay at least 5%, The city attorneys just agreed to pay 10%, and other bargaining units are considering that now. We recommend that as a way of controlling healthcare costs, that all city employees contribute 10%, and that we also maintain the reforms that you've already adopted, particularly around pensions. And then finally, we're recommending looking at new revenue sources, particularly for our streets program. So with that, I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Santana. And I noticed that the PowerPoint did go up midstream, but for those who didn't catch the beginning of it, it is available at cao.lacity.org, and the full report as well as the PowerPoint is available for the public there?
That's correct.
Okay. Before we go to questions for Mr. Santana, I'd like to ask our Chief Legislative Analyst, Jerry Miller, to join him at the table and provide any comments that he may have on the report. And also, if you can, Mr. Miller, discuss the budgetary process from here forward, where we are in the process now and what we have ahead of us, and also with particular reference to opportunities that the public will have to provide comment during that process.
Certainly. Good evening. Okay, I'll start off with the process first. Under the city charter, the mayor has to release the budget by April 20th of each year. This year that falls on a Sunday, so that date would fall on the 21st. And of course, as always, we're hopeful actually that the budget is released earlier than that, but it must be released no later than Monday the 21st. Once the budget is released, then my staff, and again, for purposes of the public and sort of a newly constituted committee as well to some degree, the first report we put out within about a week of the budget being released, and in essence, what that does is summarizes the major points of the mayor's proposed budget. It also analyzes policy compliance with council policies, whether it be the reserve fund policies, the budget stabilization fund, the infrastructure investment, et cetera, as well as an analysis of the one-time fixes to close the budget gap. This committee then has a series of hearings that last a number of days. Generally, each department comes before you with their specific issues and concerns and questions. And then throughout the process, of course, the public has an opportunity to address you on specific issues, whether it be animal services issues, whether it be cultural affairs, human services, police, fire, et cetera. And of course, my staff is working with you throughout that process. When your committee hearings end, my staff goes back to the office then in the evenings and works through any issues and questions that came up for that day and prepare for the next day. So it's a very intense effort. And then the council then would have to, then this committee would send a report to the full council for the council's consideration. Generally, that happens in a special meeting, and it occurs usually within one day. It's a single agenda item that lasts throughout the day. And there's always some confusion as well. What this document would be coming from your committee is recommended changes to the mayor's budget. So if members of the public don't see something reflected in your actions, what that means is that you have decided to leave those alone in the mayor's budget, and they're moving through as proposed by the mayor. So again, under the city charter, there is no way the city would not have a balanced budget. There are time limits by which the council must act. There are then time limits by which the mayor would either veto or adopt the resolution. So in all cases, by June 15th, there will be a balanced budget in place. So again, the public has an opportunity throughout your committee hearings and individual departments. You come back and then take the actions of the committee, and there are opportunities there. And then it generally goes on to the council from there. Usually the budget is introduced and public comment is taken the Friday before the budget's heard. So again, that's another opportunity before the full city council for the public to weigh in.
And so again, just to reiterate on that point for folks at home and the folks that are here, as of today, the council does not have even a draft budget before it. For the next month, the mayor will continue to work with the general managers of the departments, with the CAO's office, and with other stakeholders. Has already taken input from neighborhood council budget advocates and others He has a survey, I think, that's still that he's still operating to try to provide public input, and drawing all that together to prepare a draft budget, which will then be presented to the council about a month from now. But as of today, we've not yet even seen the draft budget for the fiscal year that begins on July 1st.
Correct. And just a couple of brief comments on Mr. Santana's report. Again, the city has taken some really remarkable steps in balancing the budget. Mr. Chair, as you indicated, a projected $1 billion deficit is 80% solved. However, I would stress the need for continued restraint in spending. Again, with some history now, back in early 2005, well before the recession, then CAO Bill Fujioka and I released a report that said at that time our expenditures were increasing faster than our revenues. Essentially, we were perpetuating a structural balance. And then when the recession did hit, we had a very, very difficult time to respond. And then in looking at these projections, and again, as Miguel indicated, these are not the final budget numbers. They'll change somewhat. But a year ago, the projected budget deficit for the coming fiscal year was about $150 million, and it's now $242. The projected budget deficit in fiscal year 2018 at that time was $15 million. It's now $83. And so I'm not suggesting necessarily we're going in the wrong direction, but what this points out is the recognition that although the economy is recovering and revenues are growing, fiscal restraint is going to be important to make sure that we do get to structural balance and put ourselves in a good place going forward. He also had the chart indicating that revenues were growing at about 4.5% with our 7 major revenue sources. As you recall from the budget stabilization policy, historically those grow at about 3%. So I think we're also going to be working with you and looking at the growth over 3% as more of a one-time revenue increase rather than ongoing, because we cannot plan on being able to spend 4.5% more per year on those 7 revenues. It simply doesn't work out that way. And I think that's also evidenced by the fact that while our revenues in general grow about 3%, our pension systems assume salary growth of 4.5%. Now, clearly, since we're a majority salary entity, that also is not sustainable. So the increase in our expenditures, I'm sorry, not just salaries, our overall compensation. So we need to bring our overall compensation in line with our growth in revenues, or we will be perpetuating a structural imbalance. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
All right. Thank you. Members, questions? Mr. Englander?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Can you sort of put it in context and how this might relate to other large cities in terms of, I don't think we're alone. I don't think the city of LA has been an island in going through these tough economic times in this recession and growing out of it as well. So putting it into context, what we've been able to do compared to other large cities, particularly perhaps, I think, looking at how does that compare to whatever we model it after or benchmark it after, whether that is our reserve account, our bond ratings, how are we judged by what we've done fiscally in our cutbacks, our layoffs, our furloughs, our ERIP, and what that's done to affect what expert analysis has looked at the city of LA and particularly bonding agencies, because and that's a huge benchmark, an indicator, an index to measure up not just how we're doing, but how do we really compare based on what we have done with all the issues that you've just gone through and highlighted. So if you can walk us through that, I think it'd be very helpful.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned bond rating agencies. So recently, Standard & Poor's went through a review of all cities, all major cities, and I was at a meeting with my colleagues from the 20 largest cities, where we all sort of anticipated what kind of grade, if you will, we would get, and we all sort of shared our respective experiences over the last 4 years. And the city of Los Angeles bond rating was reaffirmed, and in that analysis that Standard & Poor's did, They talked about the fiscal constraint that your council has demonstrated, the sound fiscal policies, the various reforms like pension reform. There was specific mention of the fact that the city doesn't just wait till once a year to deal with its deficit. It does so on an ongoing basis. And so it was a reaffirmation of the work that you've put in place. Now, it would have been nice to get an upgrade, but they also mentioned some of our challenges. Some of them we can't control, the fact that, unlike other parts of the country, we have to go to the voters for increases in revenue. Others are the fact that that we're still, our unemployment, while it's declining, is still a little higher than it is in other jurisdictions. In contrast to that, Chicago was recently downgraded. And the downgrade Chicago experienced is due to the fact, well, they're experiencing a similar sort of economic growth that we are, but their downgrade really came as a result of their inability to control their pension costs. And unlike the city of Los Angeles, your colleagues in Chicago really can't control pensions. It's really controlled by the state of Illinois. And so that has put the mayor and the council in a very difficult position to see this looming liability without the authority. Now, some of that has changed more recently, but, you know, in talking to folks there, they feel like, you know, it's almost impossible at this point to confront. Chicago, when the recession hit, you know, your council made the decision to take it on with as many ongoing solutions as possible. And it was a very difficult time. For those of you who were here, no different than it was for the state. If you were in the state, unfortunately, we had layoffs. We had to renegotiate our contracts. We eliminated departments. Chicago at that time used one-time solutions to deal with their deficit, and then had to confront the deficit the following year, plus the new deficit that they confronted. So we draw the comparison with Chicago because they you know, are the closest in size to us in some ways, and, you know, certainly a major metropolitan area. But really, it tells a story of two different cities. And so I think the city is no different than other major jurisdictions around the country in that the drivers are all the same. We are the reason why our costs are growing. And while revenues continue to grow, they're simply not catching up to those expenditures. And the economy in major metropolitan areas is improving, but simply not improving fast enough. And as the CLA indicated, even as that growth occurs, we have to be cautious about how we look at it. Because as we know, the economy doesn't grow forever. Eventually, there's another downturn. And so finding that balance is important.
And what about the other 18 cities? I mean, you mentioned the largest 20 cities. How do we sort of compare and match up in our reserve accounts and,
well, in terms of
and
our
everything
reserve,
else we've done?
In our report on page 21, we sort of draw a comparison to ourselves and the 10 largest U.S. cities in terms of our reserves. And our reserves are now comparable to where they are in most the 10 largest cities in the country. And so each one has specific jurisdictions. New York actually has a very small reserve because of the fiscal crisis they went through in the 1970s, where they're simply they're not allowed to have a deficit projected out. And so that in turn, they treat their reserve fund differently. So the city is, in fact, doing well when it comes to restoring the reserves. We recommend 10% as probably the right mark. If you look at the S&P credit report, the cities that had a reserve 10%, like for example the county has a reserve exceeding 10%, has a higher bond rating than we do. And so that's one of the major indicators that they look at in terms of establishing what bond rating to have.
Mr. Kretz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Any sound? There we go. First of all, you said that we we identified the structural deficit before we really hit hard economic times back in 2005. What was causing the structural deficit back then, and what's continued to add to it over time through to the present? If you take out the economic shortfall, I think we still have some problems. So what are those items? What caused us to be in that situation that we're in, where the economy is recovering, but we still have that shortfall lingering?
Well, I think primarily it had to do with rapidly increasing compensation, both in terms of staffing up. Again, I think Mr. Santana's chart on the peak workforce, I believe, was in 2003, 2004 timeframe. So that, as well as additional staff, additional increase in compensation, additional pension liabilities, et cetera, and those were growing faster than our ongoing revenues. And for a number of years, a lot of the budget balancing actions were either very clearly one-time revenues to balance ongoing expenditures, or to offset ongoing expenditures, or, as I indicated, it was really looking at those ongoing revenue sources and seeing that they were growing faster than the historic average and programming that money. So when, again, the economy turned around and those revenues actually went down, not only were we we were spending more than the 3% average, we were spending far more than that in terms of programming the ongoing revenue. So that really, and again, we're primarily a salary-based entity. We do have a large capital program, et cetera, but our salaries, particularly on our general fund side, really are driving our expenditures. And I think we continue to see the same thing now. Again, the deficits are much, much better. There will always be some level of one-time solutions in the budget. It would be unrealistic not to expect that. But again, they need to be kept to a minimum, and we need to, and now that we're coming out of the recession and we do have ongoing growing revenues, I think the focus needs to be on solving the ongoing budget issues with ongoing revenues and not one-time solutions.
Now, part of what you said was staffing up and increasing our staffing. Were there particular departments that were the most responsible for that, and if so, where are we now in those departments after having trimmed back as much as we have?
Well, again, there was a big effort in the early 2000s to hire additional police officers. And then that, of course, continued throughout the recession to try to get to that 10,000 mark. So it was hiring police officers was certainly a big part of it. I mean, again, this was, 9 years ago. In terms of drilling down in more detail on which areas we were hiring, I have to get back to you on that. But again, it's we are now exceeding 70% in public safety expenditures. It wasn't quite that high then, but the trend towards really focusing our budgetary resources in public safety has been going on for the last, certainly 10 or 15 years.
Did we ever have any sense that we had the structural ability to do that, as opposed to just the desire to do it?
There was a great deal of debate. In fact, I've had a lot of history here. There was debate about hiring additional police officers going back to Mayor Reardon, and then Mayor Hahn, and then Mayor Villaraigosa. So the issue of needing to increase the size of the police force and resources for fire as well. I don't want to leave them out. Those have been discussions that have been going on, for 20 years. In the mid-'90s, we had a recession, and I think to some degree that impacted the ability during the Reardon administration to hire police officers. So it's been an ongoing issue for many years.
Now, I know we've been studying the fire department, and the fire department has probably been the brunt of our biggest sworn cuts. I'm not sure why, but it seems like we've had an unusually light amount of interaction with our fire union as we've done these studies. Is there a reason for that?
Well, the latest PA study that was done in a similar way that we did the review of the DWP, and that analysis was done by PA, which provided an outline and a framework in which labor negotiations proceeded. A number of other reforms were done. The consultants we hired has spoken to rank and file members in the fire department. They spoke to the leadership of the department. They spoke to stakeholders outside of the city and within the city, and prepared a draft. About a month prior to the release of the draft, we reached out to UFLAC in particular and asked for their input. And we wanted to share with them what some of the findings were before the draft was released and to get their input. Unfortunately, they decided not to participate in that.
Would it not have made more sense to get their input as part of the process?
Well, the consultants did consult with rank and file and did engage in speaking to the actual workers in the department.
Yeah, I know the union and their leadership are certainly very unhappy and feel like they've been sort of worked around and not been heard. And at least in retrospect, I'd say it was an unfortunate way to handle it that has created a lot of unnecessary bad feelings. So I hope we can focus on repairing that as we go forward, as well as trying to repair the department and restore resources that are badly needed.
And I share your concern, and that was in part why we reached out to them a month before the release of the report to avoid any surprises and, frankly, to get their input based on the findings. You're correct. It would have been preferable to talk to them sooner.
And one last thought on our reserves. I like what we've been doing through this whole process, and I would like to see us hit 10% and even gradually go higher than that. Of course, I have my own experience, of course, in West Hollywood, where the city has tried to add substantially every single year to their reserves. And when they hit the recession, they had over 100% general fund and reserve. I don't expect a city of this size ever to be able to do that. But if we could actually have a reserve that would help us substantially in the next kind of shortfall. And I think it would have to be over 10% to really be something that would get us through that. I like the direction we're heading, and I at least gradually would like to see us keep heading towards 10%, and in good times even continue to add to that.
Thank you. Before we go to Mr. Blumenfield, anybody who would like to speak, please fill out one of these cards and bring it forward, and we'll have an opportunity to do that shortly. Mr. Blumenfield.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and very much appreciate the presentation and sort of the 10,000-foot level that we're at. A couple little questions before I get to just on the reserve question we've been talking about. I also agree we need to, it's very prudent of us to be looking at 10% goal for reserves. There's always that tension, though, as we start edging higher than that you never want to have the reserves. You know, there's a tension between reserves and growing our economy. And you put too much away in reserves too quickly, and you lose growth opportunities for growing the economy, and you potentially, cut off your nose to spite your face kind of thing. So I like moving to 10%, particularly looking for ways that we can take sort of one-time infusions and putting those into the reserve, but just we're in no danger of getting to that tipping point, but just being cognizant that there is that tipping point, and I don't know where it is, but economists that are smarter than me probably can figure that out, but it's probably somewhere in the 10% neighborhood that we need to just to be aware of, not as the goal to just keep building it, but to be smart about the rate at which we build it, because there is a trade-off. But we're in no danger of crossing that tipping point at this point. So I really appreciate and I also agree with some of my colleagues about as we go more granular and we can talk about, and when the budget comes out, about some of the actual proposals. But but the overall roadmap summary of recommendations I think is very good. Particularly the capacity and infrastructure types of things you talked about have been so underfunded that it's critically important that we build out that capacity. And I like the fact that you mentioned the IT capacity, because that's a big part of it as well. One thing I didn't see on the fiscal management side, which the mayor has been talking about, which may be sort of subsumed in these categories, but I thought I'd tease it out a little bit, is the performance-based budgeting issues. Now, the performance-based budgeting doesn't necessarily change the big picture numbers, but I think it is going to be part of our moving forward on responsible management. And I thought I'd ask you to speak to that, because I think there is often a confusion in the general public about what performance-based budgeting, and even though we're not moving to direct performance-based budgeting, we're moving to sort of performance-informed budgeting. But that doesn't, to explain to folks how that does or doesn't impact the overall numbers and how it's part of our general effort. I just thought there's a lot of talk about that. People are very excited about it, but I want people to understand what it means, but also what it doesn't mean vis-a-vis the numbers.
I didn't talk about it in the PowerPoint, but there is some discussion about it in sort of the larger report, starting in page 25. And essentially what performance budgeting means is that the budget, as probably the most significant policy document that any governing body adopts, really not only tells the reader how money is being spent, but more importantly actually tells you what you're buying. And so what does it mean when you invest so much in the police department or so much in street services or in transportation? What are the actual outcomes that you're achieving? And so our budgets are generally focused around what's the difference between this year and next year. And so the discussion always is limited to that very focused area. What we're, based on the leadership of the mayor and I know members of your council, there's a desire to have the budget to be much more outcome driven. And so I think the mayor has made that a priority for this budget, recognizing that it doesn't happen overnight, that in fact moving from one way of doing the budget to another takes several years. I was part of doing that at the county. It took 5 years to get there at the county, and I would say it's still not 100% the way I think they would want it to be. But at the end of this process, it's about evaluating those outcomes. Now, once you have a metrics to be able to identify those outcomes, then you could make choices about what is it that you're seeking to buy. So as part of dealing with the deficit, it's about prioritizing what you care about the most, using those outcomes as sort of the deciding factor. And so that's a part of helping us get through these next few years. It's not going to happen overnight, but ultimately will be a major tool for your council to invest in a smarter, more cost-effective way.
Thank you. One last sort of very narrow question. When you're looking at the deficits, you look at the diagram, you basically, what would be a straight line from 2011 up to 2018 has that sort of anomalous blip in 2013 where we had more revenue coming in 2013 and less revenue coming in 2014. If you smooth those two out, it's a straight line. Could you tell us a little bit about why we have seemingly some sort of revenue shifting from 2014 to 2013?
CRA. So when the state engaged in the dissolution of the CRA, there was one-time component and an ongoing component, and the city received a sizable one-time component last year that we frankly weren't anticipating to the level that we received. We also were able to identify a number of revenues from going through old accounts in the transportation department in particular, which allowed for those revenues to be taken in. So some of it was driven by the natural growth in the economy, which has been steadily improving, but a significant part of that blip was as a fact of those one-time revenues. The challenge with that is, of course, that once you receive those revenues in advance, you have to receive the same level of ongoing revenue plus more to be able to hit the mark, and that's why you see it somewhat flattened.
Right. So it's not that this year we're earning a lower rate of return for some sort of negative reason that we should be that should send off the alarms. It's more just that as a comparison to last year, which was the increased amount, that it just by comparison it looks less. But in actuality, the line is a pretty constant slope from 2012 to predicted to 2018.
That's correct, and I think the one chart that illustrates that is on page 5 that shows really the 7 general fund taxes, how they've been going, and while they dipped during the recession, they only dipped 1 year, and they slowly started growing after that. And so now you could see how the economy improving has actually resulted in those revenues increasing. And these are the base of sort of our revenues that are directly tied to the economy, with the property taxes being the largest and the most stable of all of them.
Great. Thank you.
And before we go to Mr. Bonin, I just want to follow up on that point, because there's been some discussion out there in the public, which in my view is completely intellectually dishonest, about our revenue stream, and say, well, why is the city in such difficult circumstances when there's only been 1 year where revenues actually declined? Well, the truth is that 1 year's decline was so dramatic that it took 4 years even to recover the revenue level that we were in 2009. That's the reason. And not only was that in absolute terms, but at the same time period, yes, there were increases in costs, among other things, because we had collective bargaining agreements that were in place that had increases in salaries that must be paid. There were no options available to the city. Those were the agreements that were in place. So we had costs increasing at the same time that revenue remained below the level it was in 2009 for 4 fiscal years. So, any discussion that, well, it was just 1 year of decline is just misleading the public and, in fact, false. Mr. Bonin.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Miguel and Jerry, for the presentation. A couple questions. I wanted to start with this chart, the ongoing deficit persists chart. I just wanted to be clear, as we do the outlook out to 2017-18, where the ongoing deficit is still $83 million, the assumption we're basing that on is our compensation formulas don't change, we don't renegotiate raises or anything like that. Is that correct?
Yeah, so essentially we take a picture in time, and this was established a year ago, and we look at what our projected contractual obligations are in terms of any pay raises, what our anticipated pension costs are going to be based on the latest illustrations that we received. And in those, they have a number of assumptions. We assume the size of the workforce being about the same. Then we look at things that we also know, such as in the case, a big factor in this is police overtime. So as we showed in the chart, when prior to the latest round of contracts, we used to pay a lot more for police overtime. And we moved away from cash to banking. Maintaining that's going to be very difficult, and frankly comes to an end in terms of how much we could bank on July 1st when the current contract expires. So we know we're going to have to making some contributions for that. So that's sort of what we anticipate on the expenditure side. It all assumes that the workforce stays about the same size, so there's no policy decisions, including on police hiring. That's your decision to make, so we just take a snapshot in time. Then on revenues, we assume about a 3.3% growth in revenues based on what we've experienced in the past. And so combined, that's where these two charts show. Now, this will alter, just in a month from now when the mayor's budget gets released. And so there are certain expenditures he wants to engage in based on his prerogative, and there's certain new revenue assumptions that we'll have. And so we update this only once a year during the budget process. And so there'll be one deficit that's established at the release of the budget, and then another updated version once the budget is finally approved by your council.
Mr. Blumenfield mentioned technology, and I want to mention that, and I want to use it sort of as an example for a question. we all know, I think we know intuitively, that if we invested more in technology, we would be a smarter city, we'd be a more efficient city, and presumably in the long run we would save more money for a lot of things. Are there any things that we can do that would make the deficit greater in the next fiscal year that might get us into a surplus by 2017-18, whether it's technology or anything like that? Is there anything that we can knowingly predict would do that?
Well, I think the study that will be submitted to you in about the next 30 days talks about that and looks at various critical areas and looks at how we could invest in the future to reduce some of our IT costs. Some of it's going to have to be looking at a different model about how we do the work itself, partnering with the private sector for certain functions at a more cost-effective way. Some of it is investing in new technology that we know is cheaper to maintain. There are some parts of the technology that are in such a critical state that regardless of whether this deficit exists or not, the city's going to have to invest in those because they're sort of the foundation of everything else, and we'll have to find the revenue to do that. But technology is a part of doing this. Now, in terms of your broader question about what else we could do to make this deficit bigger or smaller, since we are the biggest part of our cost as the workforce of the city, any changes to that workforce does have a direct impact on whether the deficit grows or not.
Well, yeah, I understand that. Clearly, if we reduce the size of the workforce, we reduce the size of the deficit going out. I was curious more about are there short-term investments that we have just been reluctant to make year after year after year because it would cost something and widen the deficit in this fiscal year that we could be predictably certain within 5 or 6 years would actually effectuate savings, and it would be wise to just sort of eventually, the phrase that's coming in my head is a little off color. So it would be wise to just sort of make a decision and do it.
Well, one of the things that your council is taking the first step in is in investing in our CRM technology, right? We reached a major settlement with Oracle to really shore up that program. And looking at the CRM program, and not just in terms of it as a technology to gather data in terms of how we utilize services, what parts of the community need attention, but also in terms of how it's managed. And so if you look at all the different ways residents could access the city, there's a lot of duplication. And so the CRM system allows for one centralized system that ultimately will be the principal point of contact for the community. With that system, we could examine who exactly does this work as a city family, not just in relation to ITA, which has the 3-in-1 system, but there's so many other departments that do elements of that. And if we consider consolidating that into one function, reducing the capacity for that, there may need to be an additional investment in that technology, as you indicated, but the overall costs in the short term and long term will be reduced due to the efficiencies of having it centralized. So that's one example, perhaps, that could be used where technology is aligned with the actual work itself.
Another example that's talked about a lot is business tax reform. That if we reduce business taxes, we would create more jobs, and over the period of a few years, we'd actually increase more revenue for the city. We know from accounts, public and semi-public in the newspapers that there's going to be a proposal about business tax reform in the budget. You probably know more about it than the rest of us do. That's going to be a discussion we're going to have to deal with. I think the question for a lot of us is going to be what is the evidence or the level of confidence that a hit of X dollars now will bring us a benefit or a gain of Y dollars later. given that we know this discussion is going to come in a matter of weeks, is any work being done in anticipation by either of you to sort of give us the information that I think you can predict we'll be asking for about the economic and fiscal impact?
And if I may, also, in addition to that, can you put into context the magnitude of the business tax effect on our general fund? How big of a revenue source is that relative to our general fund?
The actual amount is approximately $400 to $450 million of general fund dollars, and it's 100% discretionary dollars. So, unlike other sources of fund, and it's a source of fund where the city gets 100% of it. So, unlike sales tax, where we share that with the state, or unlike property tax, where we share that, this is a source of fund that exclusively comes to the city. What was it, about a year and a half ago, that our two offices issued a report to your council that looked at the BTAC committee recommendation. We brought outside economists to analyze some of the assumptions behind that report, their recommendation, and to discuss whether or not it's true that if you reduce the business tax, does it get replenished by the increase of other taxes? And we'll be happy to send it to you, but the shorthand bottom line was that there is an increase, but it's about an 8% increase of the tax that you actually lose. So because if you assume that some of those taxes are increasing, most of the taxes that are increasing, the city doesn't get 100% of, and so it's a modest growth. Now, having the discussion about the business tax is a fair discussion to have, and what we would propose, and we shared this with the mayor and we share it with you, is that you look at it as any other expenditure, because that's in fact what it is. You're choosing to reduce the business tax, which means that you don't have revenue, and so that should be looked against any other priorities within the city. And so within that context, then it's about setting priorities and looking at what outcomes you want to achieve.
I'm sorry, if I just might reinforce that, because I think you said that very articulately, but maybe not with the emphasis that it deserved. What the economic analysis found was that eliminating the business tax would lead to a net loss to the city of Los Angeles of $400 million, almost 10% of our general fund, even taking into account all of the job generation and revenue generation that it would create. The net loss would be $400 million, right?
That's correct.
Okay. Mr. Miller?
Well, I think the only thing I will add to that, obviously, we've not been a part of any discussions about what the mayor might propose in terms of business tax in the budget. I think that if there's a proposal to reduce the business tax, and there's a recognition of increased revenues because of that, that is something that my office is going to look at very closely. I think going forward, the difficulty is trying to establish a linkage. And again, it's absolutely correct that we are out of step in terms of our gross receipts tax with surrounding jurisdictions. The difficulty is going to be how to link adjustments to the business tax to economic activity that's made up through other revenues. I think what you're also going to be facing is the larger study of the planning and building and safety processes that the consultant is putting out. Again, they strongly recommend investing, when you speak of technology, investing in the Build LA system to do online permitting and to smooth out how businesses can grow and get permitted. So it will be quite a challenge to try and determine a causal relationship, and again, from a policy standpoint, the investments that are necessary to fix the problems that are frequently discussed that don't relate to the gross receipts tax themselves. It just relates to how difficult it can be to do business in the city.
Sure. I mean, I asked not so much to start a conversation today about the merits of the upcoming proposal, but to acknowledge that, we're in a we're in a play here. This is Act 1. Act 3 is when the council votes on the budget. And we know that there's going to be certain things discussed and certain questions asked in Act 2. And I think we all know what they are, so I just want to put them out there now, because I don't want us to get in a situation where the council's asking for information, and because Act 2 doesn't come until late April, early May, we don't have time to get the answers. For instance, I think it's fairly obvious that some members of the council will say about a proposal for business tax reform, well, we don't want to put a $400 million hole in the budget. Is there a way we can phase something or make a judicious, targeted cut, that there might be some evidence somewhere that this creates a positive impact on the budget? So if there's thinking and work that your departments and agencies can be doing on that, I think that would be good, which is why I brought that one up. The other sort of Act 1, Act 2 question I wanted to bring up was about our partners in labor in the coalition. We know that in Act 2, there's going to be a number of folks from the coalition sitting at that table with a bunch of different ideas for how to help us raise revenue, do something more efficiently, cut costs differently. And because Act 2 comes so late in the process, those ideas often don't get a thorough enough vetting. So I'm wondering if anyone's sitting down with them now and discussing their suggestions, the ones that we know they're going to bring forward, so that we can actually have a better give and take on them when they come forward.
So, as you know, the contract, the MOUs with the coalition expire at the end of this fiscal year, and my staff has already begun the process of reaching out to the coalition to talk about the successor MOUs, and with that, as it has been previous years, my expectation would be that there'll be a discussion about the state of the city's finances, just in the short term and in the long term, and a back and forth about some of our assumptions, and at that time we certainly anticipate the coalition to raise their ideas. They recently submitted a 5-page request for very different kinds of information pertaining to the bargaining units, but as well as on our revenues, assumptions, a variety of things. And so my assumption there is that they're wanting to engage in that conversation. We'll certainly provide them that information now, prior to negotiations and prior to the release of the budget.
Okay. Because a lot of their suggestions don't have anything to do with their level of compensation. Sometimes it's about the city's investment strategy, or sometimes it's about why don't you do collections better, like the city of, I don't know, San Antonio or something does that. And those are questions that would be good to start getting some information on now, so that we have a little bit more knowledge when we get them.
Right.
Any thoughts as you're working on this budget about additional cost recovery measures?
And such as?
Well, for me, I talk a lot about how Mr. Blumenfield and I, or Mr. Weezer and I, have very different districts, and in their districts, there's a lot of places where they're trying to incent economic development. And in my district, I've got a hell of a lot of development going on, and I don't think if I had a cost recovery fee for a lot of stuff that it's going to do anything at all to disincentivize development in my district. Are we going to have other cost recovery proposals coming up in this budget so we can find some other ways to bring in revenue?
That's one of the requests that we make every year from departments is, are you fully generating cost recovery for the services you provide? And if not, what needs to happen to do so? And at least since I've been here, every year there's been some adjustments to that. We look at those that we haven't done so far, and we've done practically everything at this point, but there's always one or two more that we haven't done. So that is part of the budget process, and is discussed in the context of each department. I know the CLA highlights those areas in their review of the budget, and every department talks about it when they come and present their budget to you. But that is part of a standard part of the budget that we engage in.
Okay, well, planning is one area where I think we can look at some stuff, and I'm happy to discuss some suggestions with you offline and bring them up during Act 2 of the budget
And
process.
planning and building and safety are the two departments that have done a very good job of trying to capture as much of their costs through cost recovery. Now, we have to be mindful of state law to ensure that we're not charging people for services they're not getting, and we're charging only for cost recovery and not beyond that. And we're always careful of that. But it's basically been that strategy that's kept those two departments afloat over the last few years, and has allowed for sort of an investment in the planning activities and the building safety activities that is spurring a lot of the development that we're seeing.
On LAPD, I noticed in your report you said the police department has expressed a clear relationship between the increased size of the police force and the ongoing decline in crime. I don't know that I accept that premise. Crime has gone down, and there's more people that we call police officers, but we don't have more. I don't think the evidence would show that we actually have more cops out on the street. I think we have more cops doing civilian duty. We have more people we've absorbed from other departments who are now part of LAPD, who worked for the city in uniform before. And we have lots of officers who are being sent home because they've got too much overtime accrued. So if crime is continuing to go down, I don't know that we can necessarily say that's because of the increased size of the police force, because I don't know that effectively that we have an increased police force. I don't know that that's an honest metric, and I'd love to see if we can find out a way to have a more intellectually honest conversation about the size of the police force and the impact on crime during the budget process, because effectively we don't have 10,000 cops. We've got too few cops because so many of them are get the excessive overtime, or they're doing civilian duty. And I just wanted to.
Well, that statement is something that the police chief has stated at this table and publicly, and feels strongly about. But in terms of sort of the honest conversation, as you mentioned, we do recommend independent study as one of our recommendations to actually look at the capacity of the police department, balancing the size of the workforce against overtime and the civilization of certain functions. And so, much like the analysis that's been done in the fire department, there is an opportunity to sort of determine what is the ultimate goal that we're trying to achieve here, and how does that right balance work for the future. And it may not be achievable on day one, but over a period of time. And so we're recommending that the city actually invest in an outside analysis to find sort of a more independent view of answering that question.
Okay. And the last one is just one last thing about the special funds. You said that your office and Mr. Galperin are going to have a report on the special funds next week. I hope that isn't a report like special funds reports we've seen in the past, which is the screaming daily news headline that says city wastes untold dollars sitting unspent in accounts. In a time when budgets are tight and we're not spending a ton of money out of our general fund for stuff, a lot of times those special funds are one of 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 pieces of money that get a project done, whether it's a new community center or it's ones I can think of in my district over the past decade, rebuilding the Venice Pier or creating the skate park at Venice Beach, which is sort of the biggest attraction and draw we have down there. And I know you could easily say X dollars in this special fund when there's money sitting in them waiting for the match from the other fund to get something done that may have been in the pipeline for 10 years. So I'm just hoping that this report isn't one of those that makes it sound like these are monies that would just be so much better swept into the general fund because they're sitting there wasted, because they're usually, often anyway, the anchor of good stuff that the city winds up crowing about.
That's fair.
That's all, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. It's an important point, and we've been working closely. This committee, CAO's office, and the controller have been working together to try to develop that special fund report in a user-friendly kind of way that will actually tell the story.
Cool.
Of those special funds that are being used for important, significant purposes, and there's a reason to set it up as a special fund. But there are those that perhaps that reason is no longer here, and there's surplus funds. There are others, as we saw with DOT last year, where the special fund was serving a significant purpose, but because of accounting challenges that they had, they weren't properly refunding the general fund for administrative costs that they should have been, and that's a $42 million accrued failure over the years. So those are the sorts of things that report is designed to get at. Mr. Kretz, and then Mr. Blumenfield, and members of the public, I know you're waiting very patiently. I appreciate your patience. There's a lot to cover in this report. Anybody else who hasn't filled out a card who would like to fill one out, please fill it out and bring it forward. And as soon as Mr. Kretz and Mr. Blumenfield are done, we'll begin public comment. Mr. Kretz.
Just a few things quickly on the comments about the business community. First of all, I think there are people that complain about our high rate of business tax, but I think the greater complaints that I hear and the greater issue that I think creates the image of us being so business unfriendly is an inadequately quick process of planning and permitting. And so I think it's important that if we are going to expend funds to deal with growing our business community, I think it's considerably more cost effective to deal with that problem first than it is to focus on eliminating our business tax. I do have a couple of thoughts on the business tax. Number one, I think just from a PR standpoint, and it doesn't necessarily have to be this year, but I think we need to get ourselves off the top of the list. I think it's a bad idea for us to have the highest rate of business tax in the county. I don't know that we have to eliminate it, but I don't think we want to keep ourselves in that position. The other question is whether there's a way to structure a business tax differently, because as a gross receipts tax, we're taxing people on activity. So you can pay a lot and not be making very much money. I suspect you can even be losing money and pay a fair amount in gross receipts tax. So I'm not sure it deals adequately with businesses that have low margins, and if there are a way to keep the tax at the level it's at, or even reduce it but not eliminate it, but find a way to do it in a way that businesses find less onerous. And I don't know what the answer is to that, if there are other ways that business taxes are structured so it's not based just on the level of activity.
I think that's part of the conversation that your council will be having is you know, there's many different alternatives, and if the goal is job creation, what other ways can you actually get there? And looking at the region is one way of defining success and how we fare up, but also how you investing those precious general fund dollars in a way to stimulate economic development. So there's a lot of options that your council still has an opportunity to consider.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Blumenfield.
So it's a follow-up on the same point about business taxes and this question about how we're moving from Act 1 to Act 2. And one, to help us sort that out, would be more knowledge about the impact of the reduction in the business tax. You mentioned that there had been a study a couple of years ago, but I'm certain that, you know, the elimination of the business tax has different impacts at different levels. You know, maybe the first 15% probably has a higher, you know, impact, and then there's diminishing returns, and then maybe it jumps up at the end when you eliminate it. I don't know what the curve looks like, but somebody has studied that, and that would be very useful information. So in the spirit of putting things forward that could be useful in that discussion, because when we are having that discussion down the road, and we have to make choices in terms of timing and different things, it would be very useful to have some sort of quantitative understanding of the impact of different levels of the business tax and the timing of that. And that may be difficult information to get. It's probably, there's no definitive study on it, but soliciting some information about it now would be useful for phase 2.
Thank you very much. Just to wrap up, I just wanted to ask you to give one quick little overview, which we probably should have started with. And Mr. Miller, I think you mentioned, again, almost in passing, 70% for public safety. I'd like, Mr. Santana, if you could, to just give an overview of the major components of where the general fund is spent, so that people can kind of understand the larger context. Because when you hear $250 million in a $4.4 billion general fund or so, people might say, well, why not just do a 5% across the board cut then, and that'll take care of the problem. Can you talk a little bit about what the major components of the budget are so that it fits it into a larger context?
Well, when we talk about the budget, there's really two major components. There's the general fund, which for the people watching at home, it's essentially the discretionary dollars that the council has. And then there are the special funds, which are earmarked for specific purposes. So a dollar that's earmarked for special funds can't be used for a general fund purpose. And so if you look at in terms of last year, we had a budget of about $7.2 billion, of which 47% of it was discretionary, and almost half of it had a specific purpose. So there's a very small limitation. Most of it goes to public safety. Of your discretionary dollars, we're no different than most other cities around the country, where fire and police are the primary expenditures, and 70% is what it is this budget, and it'll probably change slightly to the higher next year. Everything else, 5% of our discretionary dollars goes to fund animal services, city attorney, controller, my office, cultural affairs, emergency management, finance, the mayor, your offices, the city clerk, disability, zoo, and a few others.
All of those things combined
Within 5%.
comprise 5% of the budget.
Of your discretionary dollars, correct. And so when people say, well, why don't you cut everything by 1% or by 5% or by 10%, that's in fact what we've done. And so of all the departments I've listed, each one of them, including your office, are smaller today than they were 4 years ago. And in an effort to protect public safety, which everyone would argue would be the city's most important function, we've done that. Now, even within that context, the civilian workforce within the police department has been declined, and so now you have police officers in our jails that we didn't have at the beginning.
Serving as jailers.
The jailers, right? Yes. Thank you for that correction. Yes. And one of the major recommendations in the PA study in the fire is that we move towards civilianizing the fire department to a greater degree. So the city has, in fact, done everything it can to contract the size of the workforce and has maintained it. And so there is very little flexibility left. And so what's now left is to reprioritize, to decide this is more important than that, to identify new sources of revenue, as we attempted to last year and hopefully will consider in the future, and to find alternative ways of providing the same service in a more cost-efficient manner.
And if we could just very briefly add to that as well, when you look at the $4.4 billion general fund number, that is not all discretionary. That is general fund, but that includes debt service. That includes the charter-required allocations for library, the charter-required allocations for recreation and parks. That includes pension payments. That includes health care payments.
All things which cannot be cut.
Our lights, our water.
Yeah, exactly. Our utilities, some of them can be tinkering around the edges again, but that knocks about half of it off. So when you're really looking at a $250 million deficit, you've got a $2.5 billion base you're working from, and that's 10%. And as Miguel said, all of those departments only comprise 5% of the general fund. So it's not a minimal problem that can be handled by some adjustments.
All right, very good. Thank you both very much. I appreciate your comments and your report. So we have agendized 2 agenda items today. One was this report, and the second agenda item was comments from the public regarding their budget priorities for fiscal year 2014-15. We did that on purpose so that members of the public would have the opportunity to comment on anything contained in this report that you've just heard, but you're not at all limited to that. You can provide comment on anything else relating to the budget. And so that's why we set it up that way. So if you haven't yet filled out a card and would like to speak, bring one forward. And as we typically do with these hearings and at City Council as well, we'll provide a 2-minute per speaker time limit. And I'm sorry that we have to do that. Let me apologize in advance, but it's just that we have many, many cards already, and in fairness to everyone, I want to give everybody a chance to speak, so that's why we have to stick with the time limits. So our first speaker will be Don Ryan, followed by Peter Davidson. Mr. Ryan, welcome.
Thank you to the City Council members for allowing us to speak. I'm here to respond to a story that will appear in the LA Times tomorrow regarding the allocation of funds for HIV/AIDS services here in the city and the impact that the change of the HUD rubric will have on the availability of funds for the Office of AIDS program here for the city. This will become, you'll see the story tomorrow or tonight. And I just, as you review that story and as you review the impacts, I'm a longtime resident of Hollywood. In the early 90s, I was amongst a group of folks who were responding to HIV risks amongst the most vulnerable in our neighborhoods, homeless people, homeless youth, and so forth. And realizing that we as citizens needed to do something because there were certain decisions that were made at the level of the feds, the state, and the city, and the county about providing disposal services for people who inject drugs as one of the services that people were needed. We organized that ourselves as residents. And now with the change of the rubric that's coming from the feds, I'm freaked out, frankly. I'm freaked out that we might actually go back when in fact we should be going forward in terms of the need. The last thing we want now is to cut services that are actually keeping people safe, our neighborhood safe, community safe, alleyways safe, parks safe, so forth. So when you say 70% of the city budget is for public safety, needle exchange, AIDS services are public safety. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, sir. Our next speaker is Peter Davidson, and following Mr. Davidson will be a speaker who did not leave their name, but just so I can help narrow it down, the business phone has an area code of 626, and the zip code is 90065. So, Mr. Davidson, welcome.
Hello, my name is Peter Davidson. I'm an assistant professor at the University of California, San Diego, and also a resident of Los Angeles. I'm also here to speak about HIV funding and needle exchange in particular. Needle exchange, because it's been so controversial, is probably the most studied public health intervention in the last 30 years. And to ensure every drug user in the city of Los Angeles gets one new needle for every single injection to prevent the transmission of HIV, we really should be giving out about 7 million needles a year. Instead, we're only giving out 1.3 million needles for the entire county of Los Angeles. We're only barely keeping the lid on the spread of HIV amongst drug users as it is. And there's a sort of rule of thumb in the research that I do that says if the rate of HIV amongst drug users gets above 15%, it then takes off exponentially and levels off at around about 50%. At the moment, the HIV level amongst drug users in Los Angeles is 7 to 9%. But as I say, we're only just keeping the lid on this. So my request today is that you consider making up for the shortfall that's coming down the pipe from HUD and continue to fund HIV services and prevention services in the City of Los Angeles. We all know HIV epidemics are largely a function of political decisions, and deciding not to keep the necessary level of funding to prevent HIV spread will be a political decision that will lead us to a new HIV crisis. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
I am the mystery man. Thank you, Chairman Krikorian, for allowing me the opportunity to speak.
Quite all right.
My name is Joe Newland, and despite having the area code 626, I live up the street in Mount Washington, well within the city limits of Los Angeles. And while I'm only here representing myself, I'm firmly in support of the LA Community Health Project and other organizations that are here today representing the front line of service providers whose funding apparently it has been decided will be cut in just about 15 days or so. I'm very concerned about ultimately the additional costs to residents of the City of Los Angeles, residents of the county, whoever will have to bear the cost of the additional HIV cases that could result from the gap in funding. And while I can understand the short-term allure of fiscal austerity, of fiscal restraint, I think that a wiser and prudent approach would be to invest in these services that will ultimately lower the costs for the community over the long run, and also will not risk endanger the public health as the cuts will. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is B. Hendricks, who will be followed by Jim Mcquisten. Ms.
Hi.
Hendricks, welcome.
Hi, I'm Beata Henris. I'm a private resident of Los Angeles. I volunteer and support the Los Angeles Community Health Project. I believe in it wholeheartedly, and I've seen the good and the honest work that they do, especially to help stop the spread of HIV and hepatitis C. Please do not cut their funding. Thank you for your consideration.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Jim Mcquisten, followed by Shoshana Scholar.
Jim Mcquisten, as you know, I'll put something in writing later because it's too extensive to give now. But I do want to tell there are two things that we have to do, and the sooner we get to them, the better. We can pick up $35 million that we're just throwing down the drain right now. $20 million of that is because we're not assessing properly for sidewalks. And you know sidewalks don't just mean sidewalks in the state code, and we're supposed to be following the state code. The other, that's $20 million. That's actual numbers, too, out of the, if you do a little cost analysis. The other $15 million that you can pick up is out of planning. And one of the problems of planning is that the city council is doing its own planning and the planning department is doing some other planning, and the two are not getting together. And if you go over to the planning counter and you say, I want to repair cars in my garage in an R1 zone, and they say, oh, sounds pretty good. Why don't you go over and talk to your councilman and get his approval, and then you can do it. Now, this kind of thing we have to stop. It's against the state law in the first place. And if we do that, we get a little better planning, which we need. And with this $35 million, we can put in at least 3 5-acre supervised recreation places with a running track and a soccer field each every year. And this is what we really need to cut down on our local problems in the south of the Santa Monica Mountains. As you know, the valley has nice parks. We don't. And that's something that we have to work on, and we can work on it. And I will tell you also one thing.
Thank you. Sorry, Mr. Mcquisten. I'm trying to stick with the clock. Thank you. Our next speaker is Shoshana Scholar, followed by Mark McMillan.
Hi, I am a LA County HIV Commissioner, and I also am the Executive Director of Community Health Project. we run a syringe exchange and disposal that's supported by the City of Los Angeles in Hollywood, Pico Union on Skid Row and in Watts. And our work, just so you have a sense of what we do, we have needle exchange, like disposal sites that are fixed sites, but then we do a lot of outreach into the community. And that means that we go into homeless encampments, the projects. We spend a lot of time sort of just meeting people where they are, providing them health education referrals for health services, HIV testing, and substance use services. And we do this community-based syringe disposal. So we go out and hang out with drug users, and we collect used syringes from places where they would normally not be collected. We are an employer. 6 of the 8 people that work in my organization were former participants, or they come from a background that, former injection drug using background. They are now all trained professionals who are really great at connecting with the population that we're working with. And we are looking at, with the reduction in funding, potentially, everybody's hours are going to be reduced, period, but we're looking at potentially 2 or 3 layoffs, which would be a big, big problem. We are also the only syringe disposal program in Hollywood and in Pico Union. And if we don't have funding just for that 3-month gap between April 1st and July 1st, we're looking at, just my organization has 324 gallons of used syringes that we're going to have to figure out with our council members and with everybody else what they want to do with that. Do they want it not to be collected and left in the community? Do they want it collected and then stored somewhere for a later day? It's a problem. We have to figure out how to resolve this problem. Also, we do overdose prevention work. We've been working, just so you know, 26 lives have been saved this year alone with LA City funding from our overdose prevention work, and thank you. That's for you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Mark McMillan, followed by Simon Costello.
Mr. Chairman, council members, thank you for hearing me. Mrs. Santana and Miller, thank you. I'm also a commissioner on the LA County Commission on HIV. I'm HIV positive. I'm a consumer. I would like to represent the consumer's point of view from this perspective with regard to services for HIV. The national HIV strategy says that we want to get more people engaged in care. If we take away this funding, more people will fall out of care, and then we won't be able to get to people being engaged in care so they can get to the undetectable level, which has shown to prevent HIV transmission. So I strongly urge to keep the funding at the level it was, restore the funding that's been being blocked, and so we can continue to get to that national HIV strategy goal. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Our next speaker is Simon Costello, followed by Aaron Fox.
Good evening, council members. I'm Simon Costello with the LA Gay and Lesbian Centre, and I am also here to speak about the shortfall in the budget for HIV services. The LA Gay and Lesbian Centre has had a collaboration with the Department of Disability AIDS Coordinator's Office for 8 years now. We provide a range of services to homeless and unstably housed youth. The goal of our program is to help them to provide resources to help them become independent and purposeful members of society. And obviously HIV education and prevention is very important in that work. To give you a flavour of the work that we do, we see about 100 young people a day in our program. We see about 1,100 unduplicated young people every year. About 60% identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender. 80% are young people of colour. 40% have been in the foster care system. All of them, are suffering from rejection, discrimination, and the impact of poverty. So it's a very high-risk population. Population is very high risk for HIV and STDs. We've worked with the AIDS Coordinator's Office, as I say, for 8 years. We have a program that's very effective. It's very cost-effective. It has really good outcomes. Over 65% of the young people who go to the program indicate intentions to change the behaviour to reduce the risk of HIV, and they maintain those behaviours. So I would just like to ask the Council's support to bridge that funding gap. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Aaron Fox, followed by Angelica Skoras.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Council members. I'm glad that this conversation started out with what happened in 2009. Because I think that we have lessons to learn from that. And I'm sure that Councilmember Blumenfield will remember in 2009, Governor Schwarzenegger vetoed $82 million in HIV/AIDS funding from the state budget. and that put all localities essentially in a crisis mode. And I think that we find ourselves again in a situation here where the prevention funding that comes through the AIDS coordinator's office is even more important because we still have no prevention funding from the state of California. And the CDC recently did a study on those 2009 cuts. Of that $82 million, about $30 million of that was specifically for HIV prevention. And if we look at what happened in California after those cuts, the direct results were 1,400 fewer diagnosed infections, 32,000 people didn't receive risk reduction services, and most alarming, 220 new infections generated from these cuts, totaling $80 million in lifetime treatment cuts. So we can see that while some things in the short term may seem fiscally appropriate, if we take a long-term look at what this actually does to our community and the impact that it has, it's just not fiscally sound. So on behalf of the LA Gay and Lesbian Center, we would ask that the City Council take any measures it can to bridge the 3-month funding gap at the end of the HUD grant, and then also fund HIV/AIDS services in the city at 100%, not at just 57%. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Angelica Skoris, followed by Daniel Wiseman.
Good evening.
Good evening.
My name is Angelica Skoris, and I'm the director of the Center for Harm Reduction for Homeless Healthcare Los Angeles. For years, Homeless Healthcare Los Angeles has been dedicated to providing critical services to the most vulnerable, highest risk, most underserved individuals in Los Angeles County. I commend you on funding us and in the past. However, I'm very concerned about the future. We've done incredible work to establish an incredible HIV prevention program through our syringe exchange, similar to Shoshana's, located just a few blocks away from here. Ground zero of homelessness, as we all know, Skid Row. This is not a budgetary issue. This is a public health issue. Programs such as these save lives. Bottom line, 500,000 syringes were collected last year from my organization alone. That's 500,000 lives that were saved. In addition, we have an overdose prevention program. And with that program, since 2006, over 700 individuals have been trained and 300 individuals have been saved. Lives similar to Philip Seymour Hoffman. We are a crucial connector to many services besides HIV testing, treatment, and linkage. The return on the investment is clear. 11 cents for one syringe. $40,000 a year for HIV medication for the rest of their lives. Who's going to pick up the tab for that? Not only that, but the syringes that we collect, the 500,000 in last year alone, those are on the beaches, the playgrounds, the schools that our children, grandchildren, and families play on. This impacts us all, and I urge you to save a life. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry? She's going to be next anyway, so if you'd like to speak, Dr. Wiseman, all right. Then Dr. Wiseman will pass. We'll go to Joanne Ivanic Garb of the Budget Advocate, Neighborhood Council Budget Advocates.
Co-chair. There is no survey this year, so don't look for a survey. How many aging people do we have in the workforce this year? I know that within the next 10 years we have, and even 5 years, about 30% of the workforce in many departments are going to be going out. They're going to be going out at age 55 because that's the normal retirement age, with with lifespans going to 85 in many cases. We've got a 30-year nut to crack. That's a lot of money, and I don't know if we can keep up with it. We also, on the business end, today's newspaper, Occidental Petroleum is leaving the city. They're going to Texas. And in the article, Governor Rick Perry is bragging how much money he is going to spend in California and particularly LA to get the businesses to come back to Texas. we need to start fighting this. We need to start fighting the ground, go onto the ground and get boots on the ground on this issue. With people, another thing on the retirement, I jokingly say to my husband, you cannot retire until you're 73 or 74 years old. And I'll say, because I don't want you in my hair. Okay? The real reason is the amount of money that we're going to have to live on for the next 20 to 30 years. We don't have it. And if you see the commercials on TV, how many people, their retirement funds are going to last them until about age 70. So we have a lot of people who need to stay in the workforce, and this is going to present a problem for the taxes for everybody. Contracting with the private enterprise. I have two things to say: Target and Eric Snowden.
All right. Thank you very much. All right, Dr. Wiseman, you're going to speak after all.
Thank you
Wiseman.
for one of many accommodations. Now, this isn't the first time, and I hope it would be the last time that I'm going to say that 2 minutes for us individually is an insult. You should be ashamed of yourselves to do that.
I'm not going to get in a back and forth with you. I've always brought you to the table and always heard you. This is not the time.
Well, I'm glad you're hearing me once more, because I feel so much better to have said it. Now, the whole issue here, these are very broad issues, and I do not envy the things that you have to do. But I'm hearing the same old, year after year after year. The basic principles that were expounded by the controller, picked up very actively by Mr. Englander in so-called performance-based budgeting, are in process, and I hope that process continues. Right now, we have a budget which is 85% salaries, and so we've been a salary-based budget for the last 10 years in my experience. When you try to get rid of a deficit, but you have that nut, that's an uncrackable nut. Until we address the issue of what this budget deficit is all about, we're not going to solve it. It's a fallacy that we have a budget deficit that is driven by some external causes. I disagree when Mr. Santana says that we have to look at the broad picture and not realize that the budget deficit is something the mayor allows every year. And he allows it because we have an increasing amount of salaries for our employees and do not ask more work of them. But we're now going to performance-informed budgeting. Mr. Blumenfeld, thank you very much for using that term. I hope it works.
Okay, thank you. Our next speaker is Joe Montes, followed by Yolanda Delgado.
Good evening. My name is Joe Montes. I work for Bienestar Human Services. I oversee the syringe disposal program and the testing program at Bienestar. Last week, we were informed that the city is cutting HIV prevention funding beginning April 1st for 3 months. Also, that the funding is yet to be identified beginning July 1st. Currently, our agency is providing services at 4 different syringe disposal sites 5 times a week. We see anywhere from 20 to 30 clients per venue every day. Each client brings anywhere from 50 to 100 syringes to dispose of. We also provide HIV testing through this funding. We've been able to estimate that during this 3-month gap, our agency will not be able to test hundreds of individuals. 20,000 syringes that we would have been able to dispose of will not be disposed of. 350 people who regularly use our needle exchange program will have to leave the city to get help. I appreciate your time, and all that we can ask is hopefully that the city is able to identify funding for the next 3 months. And if we're not able to identify funding for the next 3 months, hopefully we're able to identify funding come July 1st. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Yolanda Delgado, followed by J. Walton Centerfit. Good evening.
Good evening. My name is Yolanda Delgado. I also work at Bienestar Human Services. Like Joe Montes was saying last week, we found out that they were cutting the funding. Myself, I was an ex-client. I used to come to the disposal, and now I'm working here. I go to different sites, and I feel that is very helpful. I believe that if we didn't have these syringe exposals, they would be out there in the street, and then it would harm other people. We also refer people to detox and treatment centers and to other services that we have. We also do HIV testing, and I believe that that's very important for people to check their status. Again, I'm just going to make this short because Joe Montes said most of that. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is J. Walton Centerfit, followed by Maria Sippen.
Thank you very much. I'm Dr. Walt Centerfit, a public health epidemiologist and scientist in the county for 20 years, an advocate and sometimes activist. And also a former visiting scientist and consultant to the CDC on HIV prevention, during which service I had an opportunity to evaluate several of the kinds of HIV prevention programs that the AIDS Coordinator's Office funds. You've got a lot of big problems to worry about. This is a fairly small one and solvable one because of the change in federal funding regulations. There's going to be this interruption of service delivered extremely cost-effectively by a number of your contracts to small community organizations with skilled people working for fairly low wages, but very effectively with accumulated human capital and capacity. The role of the city's AIDS program is not large numerically in the total HIV prevention compared to what the county does, but it's unique. The city has historically and courageously funded things like programs associated with harm reduction and needle exchange that were put under the leadership of the former coordinator Ferd Egan and Mayor Reardon and the successors that the county has not been able to or was not willing to do. They have been able to reach out to small pockets of the most vulnerable, the most burdened parts of our population at the highest risk in ways that the county programs have not done. Now, because of this shortfall, 3 months being able to laying off people who are working on marginal salaries will destroy human capital. We're not sure that even if with full funding restored on July 1st, that you will not have lost some of this capacity already. Preventing even 3 infections a year is not only cost effective, but cost saving for this $1 million investment. We ask you to come up with this $250,000 for this 3-month shortfall and define the rest of this 43% or $430,000 that the mayor's office said they haven't been able to find in budgeting for next year.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Maria Sippen, followed by Jason Wise.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello. My name is Maria Sippen. I'm a resident of downtown LA, and I also work in Hollywood at Children's Hospital Los Angeles. I had to write my script down today, otherwise I'd be advocating for MyFig, better bike lanes, and better sidewalks. But I'm here to talk about HIV services. This city has been a leader in addressing HIV in the nation. LA has been at the forefront of curbing the epidemic among Angelenos, thanks to the development of the AIDS Coordinator's Office, funding needle exchange programs, and supporting critical HIV programs, like those dedicated to transgender youth. The proposed 3-month absence of funding and proposed cuts will devastate the necessary work being done in LA and will negatively affect the lives of my friends, family, and neighbors. Please reconsider the budget cuts. The long-term benefits of this to the city and the health of communities far outweigh the costs. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Jason Wise, followed by David Barron.
Good evening. I'm here on behalf of AIDS Project Los Angeles, and we would like to add our voice to all the other community advocates here in support of the AIDS Coordinator's Office to oppose these funding cuts that have been discussed, and especially to oppose this 3-month gap in services that is being proposed for just 2 weeks from tomorrow, which can be very devastating for a lot of these programs, which a lot of advocates already talked about. The AIDS Coordinator's Office has traditionally funded a lot of innovative prevention programs, and we've heard a lot about multiple of those today. The syringe exchange program, extremely important. I think it's important to note that federal funds cannot be used for syringe exchange, so this is really one of the only sources when we get down to it here at the local level to prevent HIV spread through that method. Another innovative program is APLA's Red Circle Project, which, if you're not aware, LA is home of the largest urban Native American population in the country, and Native Americans are disproportionately impacted by HIV. This is the only program in the area that's working with this population. There's programs with transgender youth and testing. There's a lot of different programs running through this very small budget. So when we're really looking at the amount of money in the general fund and the $1 million that funds these programs, or the $250,000 that funds this next 3 months, it's really just a drop in the bucket in the overall picture, but it's a drop that could have a very large impact on the public health of Angelenos. So we would hope that we can work something out here to fund this gap. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Our next speaker is David Barron, followed by Bill Gallagher.
Budget Committee, good evening. Ladies and gentlemen, throughout the city of Los Angeles, the ultimate goal here is to generate lots of revenue to fund our safety and core services. And we can achieve that by abolishing the city's business tax, which has driven employers right out of town, contributing to the high unemployment here in our city. It was interesting to hear Mayor Garcetti recently showing interest in repealing the business tax. So I just ask that you fully fund the public safety, which always is and shall be priority, which will help its protection and which will also show an invitation to employers to return back and to invite new employers to put everybody back to work so that we can generate a tax base and grow that, and also to perhaps expand code enforcement, which can handle and clean up the city as well as generate revenue. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Bill Gallagher, followed by Robert Gomez.
Good evening, Chairman Kukurian, members of the council. I'm Bill Gallagher. I'm a campaign coordinator with California Nurses Association and National Nurses United, also a LA City resident up in Mount Washington. I just wanted to say a couple brief things. It's already been covered here how important the services are that are being provided and are at risk. But, much of what we think of as our modern public health system was started by nurses in the late 1800s in New York and Boston, the Henry Street Settlement, et cetera, going out into the communities, organizing themselves into teams to go out into the communities to do exactly what these providers are doing now, which is education and treatment of people in vulnerable populations. The nurses would just like to say that the services that are going to be cut are among the most basic. And this $260,000 that is apparently not there needs to be there. So I'm in favor of and in support of the service providers against any 3-month or even 3-day suspension of funding for these most vital services. And to say that, $260,000, that could put thousands of people in jeopardy, that's the cost. That's less than the cost of what one new infection could end up running us in hospitalization, medical care, medicines, you name it. So I really urge you, please, on behalf of the nurses, and we don't want anybody to become a patient that doesn't have to be. Please make sure those cuts do not go into effect. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Robert Gomez, followed by Dawn Lovelace.
Good evening.
Good evening.
My name is Robert Gomez from Bienestar Human Services. I oversee a counseling program funded by the City of LA AIDS Coordinator's Office, which targets young gay Latino men of color or young men of color in South LA. This is a population that is disproportionately affected by HIV. Our counseling program has been going strong for 3 years now, but come March 31st, it will end. This already underserved community will lose another resource. And not only will we lose a youth counselor, but a person that is out in the field, educating at local schools on HIV, conducting outreach at venues where youth congregate, manning tables at health fairs, and referring to other services. I ask that this be taken into consideration. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Dawn Lovelace, followed by John Thompson. Good evening.
Good evening. My name is Dawn Lovelace. I'm the Civic Engagement Coordinator for St. Barnabas Senior Services, and we have two sites, one in Mid-City, LA, and another in Hollywood. And I'm here today to just address the cuts to the community block grant funding for evidence-based programs. These evidence-based programs are designed and scientifically have proven to keep seniors living well, aging well, and feeling well. And it is the core of St. Barnabas Senior Services programming. It is the basis of our clients and constituents who frequent our centers. It's why they're there. And we just really are dismayed about the cuts. And I'm curious as to where that, we were told at a housing committee hearing late February that they were looking for, that the council was looking for other funding options or other places where they could pull the funding from. We're wondering where that could be. These seniors will be left without any programming that will allow them, and we're going to have to stop the existing programs right away as a result of this. So we just appeal to you once again to help us bridge the gap. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Our next speaker is John Thompson, followed by Susan Forrest.
Good evening.
Good evening.
My name is John Thompson, and I'm here also to speak about the proposed cuts with the Department of Disability AIDS Coordinator's Office. I'm a social worker and the program coordinator for the HIV Prevention and Care Services at St. John's Well Child and Family Center. St. John's is a network of 11 federally qualified health centers that serve the communities of South LA and Compton. And we are one of the many organizations that are going to be affected by these cuts. We've had a relationship with the AIDS Coordinator's Office for the last several years, and my agency not will only be affected by these cuts, but my position will be as well. So this is something that will affect our community as well as me personally. While I don't pretend to know what it's like to manage a budget for a city the size of LA, one thing I do know is what makes these cuts different from cuts to other programs. Something that I heard mentioned earlier was cuts are happening across the board, and I do recognize that they are. And something I also heard was these are all important and imperative services. But I think what makes the cuts to the AIDS Coordinator's Office different is that HIV. People's lives depend on these dollars in a very literal way. And that is something that I'm almost positive cannot be said for some of the other programs facing cuts as well. The other thing that makes this different is what other program, what other area that are facing cuts drew this many people to show what these dollars means to us and to show our support for these dollars. So I just really want you to consider this. I really plead for you to consider this as a community representative, as someone here representing my agency professionally. Please consider this and please exhaust all possible options before just writing our concerns off. Thank you.
Thank you. I can assure you your concerns will not be written off. Our next speaker, and as of now our last speaker, is Susan Forrest.
Hi, I'm Susan Forrest. I am here to join my peers, but also I'm here as a mom, which is a really weird thing for me to say because I never intended to be a mom. But actually someone who, Alexis Rivero, who has received an award posthumously from this very council, who was a very active HIV advocate. I wound up with her children when she died at age 34. Prevention services may have helped her I'm hoping they're not going to have to help these kids who are already suffering from a lot of HIV loss. And it's my work as a counselor, drug and alcohol counselor. The people who come in my office are just like their life stories are the life stories of my children, and I want to stop that. And when I think about HIV prevention, I try not to think about HIV prevention as blocks of strategies. I try to think about it as something that comes from the community to protect ourselves. And syringe exchange, or disposal, whatever you want to call it, syringe exchange came from the community that needed it, and the community has always supported it, and it's proven to be effective. And so while all the other prevention programs that are out there, I totally support finding the funding for, in my heart in particular, I really hope that we find some funding for syringe exchange, because that we know the community supports, it's effective, it's measurable. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And that's our final speaker. Thank you all for coming down and for your patience tonight. And just for those of you who haven't come to council before, I just wanted to let you know that all of you who spoke, we did not respond to you. There's a reason for that, and that is that this specific issue is not agendized for tonight's meeting, so we don't exchange in a back and forth, because then we're discussing an item that hasn't been agendized. That being said, we can provide a brief response, I think, and I want you to know, all of you, first of all, that I think I can speak for all of us in saying how much we appreciate the service that you provide to our community through the many important agencies that you represent. It's vital, life-saving work, and we recognize and acknowledge that. And I for one, and I think all of my colleagues, understand the value of the services that you provide. One of the things I was very proud of in the legislature was being the author of AB 1894, which required reimbursement in all settings, clinical settings, of routine HIV testing. And that was one of the few health mandate, the only health mandate that passed that year, actually. It was a very important step forward in routinizing HIV testing. So this is vitally important to our city. The AIDS coordinator position is vitally important to our city. I know the mayor is working hard right now in trying to find ways to address this exact issue. And just for clarification, this is not something that this council or the mayor has decided to do, to create this cut. Just for the sake of clarity, and I know many of you spoke to this clearly, but this is another disgraceful aftermath of partisanship in Washington, D.C., resulting in cuts to absolutely essential services throughout our country. In last year's budget, partisanship and the sequester in Washington, D.C. resulted in cuts that Ms. Lovelace mentioned to our senior meals program. And it took action by this council to save $1.1 million to save 100,000 meals to our poorest, most vulnerable Angelenos. It puts us in a terribly vulnerable position as a city when the federal government doesn't maintain its commitments to these kinds of programs that are proven, that are evidence-based, that save lives. And I think it's a disgrace, and I can assure you that this committee will look at every option to try to make sure that we at least consider how we might be able to address the needs that are not being fulfilled by these changes in the CDBG funding. Members, anybody else want to speak to this briefly? Mr. Kretz?
Yeah, I mean, this is an issue that I've been involved with my whole political life since I was involved with the city of West Hollywood, and we became a city about the time that the HIV crisis really kicked in. Obviously, it's not, this particular issue isn't generated by our actions, but while we can't promise anything because this isn't on the agenda, I certainly can promise that I assume I speak for my colleagues, will do whatever we can to make sure that the kind of harm that you're nervous about won't take place. So hopefully we've given as modest direction as we can, saying what we're saying, and we look forward to working with you to resolve this crisis.
Mr. Bonnet.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Like Mr. Krikorian, like Mr. Koretz, and like the other members of this committee, I just want to say you've been heard tonight. I think it's impossible to be a gay man in his late 40s and not understand this issue and its consequences. I think it's very hard to be someone in recovery in Los Angeles and not understand this issue and its consequences. This isn't particularly with needle exchange, this isn't the most popular or celebrated issue in the world, but the cause is right, and the issue has had a dramatic impact on saving lives, and it's one that this council takes seriously. I know my colleague Mitch O'Farrell is not here with me today. I haven't spoken with him on this. I can assure you he's absolutely on the same page with me. Staff is working on this. We want to help. We will do our best to help, and we'll try. But you've been heard, and I thank you for being here today.
Mr. Blumenfield.
Echo my colleagues in that we certainly hear you, and also this issue, the change in the federal interpretation of the HUD CDBG money impacts not only this, but a couple of other very critical domestic violence funds, some of the senior funds, some very vulnerable populations that we all care deeply about. That we're in this unusual position. The city has been able to be innovative on areas that were normally not part of the core city functions. Usually this is handled on the county level or the state level, but as was mentioned, we had some horrible cuts in the state funding that many of us fought against, and we're able to restore some of them. But we have had these innovative programs. We want to keep the really good programs because we know that they're working. And so it's going to be, we'll have to be very creative in trying to backfill in some way, almost $30 million. It's not simply the 260 or the 1 or 5 million. It's a lot more when you look at the other very vulnerable categories. But we all hear you, and we're all committed to trying to figure that out.
Yeah, Mr. England.
Just quickly, and I wasn't going to speak on this, but I actually got a shout out to somebody that I wanted to thank, Whitney Englander, who's my cousin, who works for the Harm Reduction Coalition and works tirelessly for these issues as well. And just some of you are shaking your head. She's very well known and a tireless advocate, and she's schooled me a little bit as well. The issue just isn't here in the fight here in Los Angeles or California for that matter, but 26 states, it's actually illegal to have needle exchange programs, which is fascinating and scary. In my previous life, before working for the city, I worked for the city. I actually represented the AIDS coordinator office and helped put together and launch their first campaign when they initiated the office. And in fact, we did the first conference that I helped put together and did all the collaborative materials for that we held at the convention center, which was to this date, I believe, the largest ever turnout with women with HIV living with AIDS. And we won numerous awards nationally for that effort as well. So I wanted to just pipe in and thank you all for coming and echo some of our chairman's remarks as well, that it's a crime that a lot of these programs are actually being cut in Washington. And in fact, we just got back from D.C. and all we heard, quite frankly, was doom and gloom from everyone, cutting everything and not communicating, not collaborating on everything, from transportation, housing, healthcare, you name it. There's just nothing moving there. And so continue that passion. and take a lot of those remarks, if you would, to our nation's capital and continue to push those legislators for increased funding for all of these programs. Thank you.
All right. And with that, again, thank you all very much for coming down and participating in this hearing, and we are adjourned.
You're watching LA City View, Channel 35.
We now join our scheduled program in progress.
To facilitate a training aspect specific to the job opportunities that were going to be created, and then an employment referral system that then worked to identify local residents who then received the training to be partnered with the job opportunities.
Interesting. And in the solar area, obviously very hot.
Sure, and for LA, like a best practice.
No pun.
Very funny. The future is bright in the solar.
You didn't.
So I had to. So LA's best practice, I think, here right now is the feed-in tariff program we were talking about earlier. You know, my business, Longevity, is not directly involved. It's not for the sort of residential business we do, but it just looks to me like a fantastic collaboration of people like LABC, a whole lot of community organizations, the city getting behind it, and it's already brought in big employers. You know, I think a 100-person company was announced on announcement of the program, and it's just in its pilot stage. And there's going to be tension, and there's going to be, you know, people trying to claw it back, but you can't go back. The future of energy is distributed. This is doing that in communities that need it and creating the training and experience that will then allow them to grow that into new markets, go further afield. You know, obviously there's 20 million people around this area to serve with similar businesses. So I think more of that and sticking with the course.
Interesting, thanks. Well, at Rouse, we love people who like to eat. Sorry, I was the only one I could follow up with food. I think one of the neatest collaborations that we've done, and our industry is all about collaboration because it spans across so many different areas. But one of the neatest ones that we've done in the last few years is our partnership with Homeboy Industries. It was one of those opportunities where a friend of mine, Michael Bustamante, and I were having lunch at the cafe, and I said, oh my God, this is the best stuff I've ever had. We've got to have this in 3,600 stores across the country. Okay, so there's the vision. Back it up, it's a cup of salsa. So working with Homeboy and recognizing, especially at that time, that it was an organization that was struggling. How can we help provide jobs? How can we make it sustainable? And then working together with them, you know, the vision was 3,600 stores and 12 million customers a day tomorrow, like tripling, right? It's a great vision, but you got to back up sometimes. And so certainly we took that opportunity to give them something sustainable. It is now in stores, certainly across the state, and we're spreading across the country. But we learned from them. We learned how to back up and bring a small business along, and now it's something that Kroger's very good at, bringing other small businesses along. And how do we help to expand and grow that? We also learned that we had a lot of experts. They didn't have food safety training. I got a lot of food safety training at my house. So how do we share that with them, bring that collaboration together, and make something very unique and sustainable, and a great offering as well?
So I think the transportation industry has always partnered very well, I think, with local community colleges, with technical schools. And oftentimes the transportation providers themselves have very, very robust training programs. And where I've seen a lot of success in the industry is, as in the transportation industry is actually getting much more technical. with intelligent transportation systems, with positive train control on the safety side, on the rail side. So as that's happened, there's been a lot of partnership between the various layers of training in the industry with the companies and the OEMs that actually provide the technology. So I think partnering is absolutely going to be key. We're involved in doing the actual positive train control project with Metrolink, and whenever we go out and do these types of projects, training is core to really embracing the new technology and the new systems, whether it's training the crews how to operate the trains or whatever. So I think just partnering with the private side that's really bringing the technology to the transportation industry is going to be what drives the success.
So stretching the definition of collaboration. The first example I want to use is Jimmy Kimmel, who 18 months ago had a couple of 100,000 subscribers on his YouTube channel, but decided to lean in a little bit over the last 12 months. And about this time last year, he did a call out on his broadcast show, inviting audience or viewers, broadcast viewers, to upload a video of their kid's reaction when they told the kid that they'd eaten their Halloween candy. Which is kind of naughty and a little bit mean, but it thousands of uploads onto his YouTube channel, which the symbol of which is that you need to engage these communities in order for them to move from being simple viewers to fans. Today he has 3 million subscribers, and his ratings on television are superb. And he's now creating digital viral pieces that are designed for YouTube. The second is an artist called Bauer, a musician called Bauer. A few months ago, he launched a song called The Harlem Shake. And thanks to the rights management technology we have, he was able to give permission to anyone in the world to use his music and create their own videos from it. Thousands of videos were uploaded of the Harlem Shake. I'm sure you saw a few of them. My favorite was The Simpsons. A few weeks later, Bauer became the first unknown artist to debut at #1 on the Billboard charts. Collaboration doesn't just mean famous people working with famous people. It can be the engagement of the fan base at large. So we try to share these best practices with every single partner type in the world. We have a public playbook, which is available at youtube.com/playbook, and it teaches you all of the ways and all of the techniques to be successful, but collaboration is definitely one of them.
Well, I'd like to turn back to the livable communities theme, and I'd like to ask actually both Alex and Danny, in particular, looking at your workers, and I can imagine it's extremely competitive in getting some of those top young college grads to join your companies given the whole landscape. And I'm curious from your standpoint what you're seeing here as what is driving them to certain communities. Is it transit? Is it the nightlife? Is it a sense of community? If you could just share a bit from in your efforts to attract the best and brightest, what you're seeing is really a driving force to keep them here and joining your company.
I'll just have a crack first. So we sort of have two workforces. One is up in Oakland, forgive me. 300 people in what looks a lot like a call center, but a lot of them are young, and a lot of what I think attracts them is the sort of culture of Oakland, which is actually really cool, and a lot of food and music and other stuff. It's a very bikeable city. We got some award from the East Bay Bicycle Coalition for having 50% of our staff ride to work, and being able to do that in a city is very attractive. So, you know, if there's a learning there for you lot in Los Angeles, those sorts of communities are attractive to young workers in fast-growing industries. But I would say the biggest thing for that group is the same as it is for the other workforce we employ, which is hundreds of contractors around the country now and around the world, in fact, doing the installation and the maintenance and being managed by people like Justin in the field for quality assurance and so on. And they're attracted to the purpose. You know, like we know a lot of our workforce cares about it, and we want to be part of something that's bigger than just, you know, switching out electricity supplies. Like, sure, it's nice you get cheaper electricity in your socket, but you also are rewiring the world to do something that we know is better than the way we used to do that. So they're engaged in a great civilizational project, actually, which is about saving ourselves from ourselves and providing electricity to ourselves with clean sources. So I think that really stands out. We get roofers, tradespeople. During the recession, it was easier. Now, as the housing starts to come back and everything, we're sort of seeing competition for that workforce, but they want to work in the solar industry because it's good work to be done and they can do well while doing it.
Ours is less of a call center and more of a playground. YouTube has the benefit of being owned by Google, and I think Google